In our last video, we went through a detailed analysis of what we can know about the historical Jesus. In this video, we shall move on to our next topic of the resurrection. Now, the resurrection is of ultimate importance to Christianity. After Jesus cleared the temple, he was asked what gives him the authority to do such things. He responded that it was because he was going to rise again. When the Pharisees asked him for a sign to validate his claims, he responded that the only sign they would receive would be his resurrection. Now, the Gospels claim that Jesus was taken down from the cross after his death, wrapped, then laid in a tomb, and after 3 days rose again. The first thing that must be said about this is that it sounds ludicrous. Any thinking person hearing this claim should immediately respond with disbelief. We are also not to think that this is only a 21st century reaction. For all of human history, people have understood that dead people stay dead. That is why when the first apostles went out preaching the resurrection, such as in this account, when Paul finishes his speech by saying, "God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead," the text then goes on to say, some people laughed and made fun when they heard Paul speak of Christ being raised from the dead. Since day one, people have understood the outrageousness of this claim. However, this did not stop the first Christians from doubling down on this fact. In one letter in the New Testament we read, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. We are of all people most pitied." Therefore, due to the ridiculous nature of the resurrection, I will demand extensive evidence. As human beings, we only have two ways of verifying truth, that of the scientific method and that of the historical method. I will therefore demand that the resurrection satisfy both of these methods. In this video, we'll begin by analyzing the scientific method. Now, the obvious question is how on earth is one to scientifically verify the resurrection? Well, after the death of Christ, all the Gospels report that he was taken down and wrapped in a linen cloth. Now, I will contend that this linen cloth is that very cloth. Now again, this sounds outlandish and absurd, and that was my reaction when I first heard about this cloth called the Shroud of Turin. All I ask is that you hear the evidence before you make up your mind. And I believe that everyone should know something about the Shroud of Turin because it is widely accepted that the Shroud of Turin is the single most studied artifact in human history.
It's one of Christendom's most precious relics. A piece of herringbone linen that's just over 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. The cloth isn't pretty to look at. It's been scarred, burned, stained, and patched. What makes it unusual is the image it bears on its surface. A shadow so faint, it seems to disappear when you approach. But if you look at it from a distance, you can make out the ghostly silhouette of a man, seen from both the front and the back. A man who appears to have been beaten, stabbed, and crucified. For the past 150 years, the cloth has been housed inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the Italian city of Turin, which is where it gets its name, the Shroud of Turin.
It took me a while to pick everything out, but then it became quite clear. Lying between the geometric patches from the fire, the image of the front and back of a man's body, with what seem like scourge marks and the very specific wounds of a crucifixion. The cloth itself is about 4 meters of linen with traces of cotton. It has a distinctive herringbone weave and the scorches from the 1532 fire. These show it was once folded in 48. And another curious set of L-shaped scars show that at one time it must also have been folded in 4. These observations could be important. This is the image the shroud reveals to the naked eye.
Now, let us begin by creating a criteria on which we can judge the shroud and ask whether this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. Now, the first issue that must be addressed for the shroud is the radiocarbon dating performed in 1988, which dated it to the 14th century. So we must ask, is the radiocarbon dating accurate? If the cloth was authentic, we would expect the radiocarbon dating to produce a date in the 1st century. However, in 1988, the carbon dating revealed a date between 1260 and 1390. So why do I dismiss the radiocarbon dating? Well, when the dating was initially taking place, the scientists decided to take 7 samples from different areas of the cloth to ensure to get a representative sample. This, of course, is a common scientific practice. Ensuring that this specific scientific practice was used was particularly necessary for the shroud, as it has been handled countless times during the centuries, been burnt by fires, and at several times rewoven. Therefore, only taking 1 sample would not obtain a representative date for the cloth. However, for reasons I don't particularly understand, it was at the last instance decided not to follow this scientific guideline, and instead of taking 7 samples, they would only take 1 from the very corner. And taking that sample from the very corner of the shroud was the least likely place to be representative of the entire cloth, as it is the region that has been the most handled throughout the centuries. Therefore, one reason I reject the radiocarbon dating of 1988 is because it did not follow the scientific guidelines. In addition, there is further evidence that invalidates the radiocarbon dating. The radiocarbon dating places the shroud between 1260 and 1390. However, a manuscript was found with a sketch of the Shroud of Turin, which is dated to the 12th century. Therefore, there is more than 130 years difference between the radiocarbon dating and that of the sketch.
Is it possible that the carbon-14 test itself was in some way flawed? It's a possibility that's gaining currency because there is new evidence that places the Shroud of Turin earlier in time. Historians have identified another Shroud of Christ in the 12th century in Constantinople. And what I want to know is if this shroud could be the same as the one in Turin. If it is, it would push the date of the Turin shroud back by at least 160 years and challenge the accuracy of the carbon-14 test. The evidence for a 12th century Shroud of Christ surfaced recently in a document called the Prey manuscript. It's in Hungary and takes its name from the scholar who first examined it. It can be reliably dated to 1196. This is one of its 5 illustrations, and it shows Jesus being placed in his burial shroud. Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg is a textile expert who is charged with preserving the fabric of the shroud. She studied these images of Christ in the manuscript and identified a number of features that reappear on the Turin shroud. The most obvious is that the figure on the shroud has the arms crossed and the thumb hidden under the hand.
On the top you see the painting with the corpse laying on a white linen, as one would expect, which is normal, a white linen. And you see the arms crossed, and you see the 4 fingers. The thumb is invisible, is hidden, and that is also a connection. It's also visible, the same on the shroud.
Lemberg is also very aware of the geometric weave of the shroud.
What is more important for a textile historian, as I am, you see painted herringbone pattern. And this herringbone pattern is a typical sign of the Shroud of Turin.
Another feature of the cloth are the holes bunched together in an L shape.
These holes here, these L holes, they are on this picture and they are on the shroud 4 times because it was folded in 4 layers. You see here small holes, a little bit bigger, and then here you see the bigger ones.
Oh, I see.
The painter of this picture must have seen the Shroud of Turin. Otherwise, it's not possible, because it's exactly the signs which we find also on the shroud in Turin.
If the carbon-14 test is right and the Turin shroud dates to the 14th century, then you wouldn't expect to find the same arrangement of holes in a shroud nearly 2 centuries older. And yet that's exactly what the Pray manuscript shows.
Professor Christopher Ramsay's of the Oxford Research Laboratory, which is actually one of the labs that is responsible for dating the shroud, says, "There's a lot of evidence that suggests to many that the shroud is older than the radiocarbon date allows, and so further research is certainly needed. Therefore, as we turn to criteria, we have to make 2 points. For those who acknowledge the need to faithfully follow the scientific method to obtain accurate results, they must reject the 1988 dating of the shroud. And this is further validated by the existence of the Pray manuscript. Now, as we begin to investigate the shroud, we must remember the 2 options that are before us. The shroud is either the work of a forger or the authentic burial cloth of Christ. These are our only 2 options. Therefore, to determine if this really did wrap the body of Christ, we must first ask the question, is there any evidence that this cloth wrapped a body at all? And this is the topic we'll be discussing in the next video.